Welcome to the Behavioral View.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first Behavioral View episode that is targeted specifically towards behavior technicians. Doesn't mean that if you're not a behavior technician, you can't watch. We're glad to have you along, but we've gotten a lot of requests for content that is meeting the needs of the technicians. So here we are. We're going to start this off with me. I am Shannon Hill. I'm the editor-in-chief at Central Reach Institute. And I am joined today by Dr. Timothy Fuller, who will tell you his job title right now at Central Reach.
I'm an instructional designer for Central Reach.
Yeah, I'm like the world's worst at remembering things like job titles. So you just have to help me out on these things. And I invited Tim to start us off with really going all the way to the very basics of basics, which is deceptively basic, right? We're going to talk about what it means to have a behavior analytic worldview. And that is what most introductory classes kind of start with. But oddly enough, it's maybe one of the most complex concepts that we encounter through the life of our work as in behavior analysis. So all yours, Tim. Break it down for us. What does it mean to have your analytic worldview if you're a behavior technician?
Well, thank you, Shannon, for having me, and thank all of those who find themselves watching this, allocating your time towards this topic. Is I think it's an indicator of your curiosity and your willingness to consider things, and that is a value of mine. And so we share that together. And so I thank you for that. And the topic of worldviews is something that I have done a fair amount of study in and also have done a fair amount of consideration around. And put broadly, the worldview, there are many different kinds. And you have one or maybe several, whether you acknowledge it or not. And a worldview is something that is pre-analytic. And, one thing that I find kind of infinitely frustrating when I was at the kind of BT level, the front care staff level, was that oftentimes I got the impression that folks would kind of, if you forgive me if this metaphor doesn't land, but the phrase pull punches, meaning they're not going to go all the way with me because they don't think I'm ready for that. And I don't like that. I think you are ready for this. This is not out of the grasp of any of us. In fact, it's shared amongst all of us. And so I'm going to get right in there with the technicality of things while trying to keep things accessible. And so when I say pre-analytic, I mean that you can disagree with someone's worldview, but you're not necessarily going to get anywhere by giving them facts. So a classic example is the atheist and the theist. And they can just butt heads all day long at one another, but there's no amount of facts on either side that's necessarily going to convince one or the other. And that's because facts, as much as they matter because we make them matter. And when it comes to a worldview, it is the assumptions you have about the way the world is organized that make sense to you, put in kind of simple terms. And you adopt a worldview, or your worldview refines over time because you experience the world, and the way you experience the world kind of helps refine your understanding of the world. And it doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. It makes it work. And perhaps a listener out there may detect some, or have a yeah, but with that, because I'm a contextualist. And as a contextualist, a way to look at the world is this notion of it works, right? And so I'm already applying my worldview to the idea of worldviews. And that's just one of the complications, but also one of the amusing aspects of this. Doesn't mean that I'm right. Doesn't mean that someone out there couldn't hear this and disagree with me considerately. And that would be totally fine with me. I'm very open to all and any worldviews. And
can I ask or throw something out there that when you said you may have overlapping worldviews, you may have more than one, you probably do. There's probably some worldviews that would say there is a right and a wrong, and there is this is the correct worldview, right? I mean, some like yours say, let's shift with evidence or whatever, but others don't. I'm not saying one is good and one is bad or one is right or one is wrong. I'm just putting that out there because some folks may not even be aware that they're holding a worldview because they believe so strongly that this is right.
Oh, sure. In fact, I think that a lot of us would find ourselves in that description a lot of the time. And that's because often we adopt a worldview without fully articulating all of its features. Now, clearly, you don't have to do that. Clearly, you can live a thriving life, be effective, be a contribution to those you are in service to, your community, the people you work with, all of that, without knowing what your quote unquote worldview is. And so it is by no means a requisite for a enriched life. You don't need to do that. Furthermore, if you spend a lot of time analytically looking at all of those kinds of things, really distilling down with clear, precise declarations of the way you assume the world to be organized, that itself, as an activity, does not necessarily mean you're going to be in a better position to make a contribution or any of the other ways you want to identify value that you're giving to the world. And so for those out there that feel really strongly, this is the way to think about things, you are not alone. There are many of you out there, and I am a great appreciator of passion as it is applied to something you care deeply about. And there may not be, there are many different ways to think about this, but I think it would be very common that the way people think the world is organized, or the universe, or however big you want to make it, or however small you want to make it, that's something that you're probably going to care very deeply of, because it says something about you. And, in the absence of passion towards that, you might find some cynicism, or you might find even some anarchism, or you might find some other form of nihilism, or some other type of way of looking at the world. Itself isn't right or wrong. It's just the place you find yourself in. And so there's really not a lot of room for right and wrong. There's no moralistic statement that you can apply to a worldview. And so if I have a disagreement with someone about something fundamental, meaning pre-analytic, it is before you can apply any analysis. That's going to probably say more about me than it is about that person. And if I take that opportunity to really understand with curiosity and compassion and empathy for that other person, I'm probably going to go a long way of figuring out a way forward. And I think this is an important element about, okay, well, what do you do about worldviews? All right, I have these ideas about the world. We'll get into what are some of the characteristic assumptions that behavior analysts have about the world. And I think that that would be helpful. And maybe we can get into some criticisms about those. We'll see where this conversation goes. But for the point here is that know that there are many different ways of looking at the world. And as right as you feel you are about the way you're looking at the world, or perhaps as curious as you are about the different ways to look at the world, just know that you're not going to walk on the other side of this nailing it down like there's one better than the other. There's really not. Just that it is a curiosity of the human experience that there's a ton of different ways to look at the world. And if you're working in schools right now, that is an incredibly diverse set of circumstances, given the number of types of professionals inside of a school system. And it is like, for those of us interested in human behavior, the schools are a really interesting constellation of ideas and of differences and of strong opinions. And so I think that the school setting is a great way to be curious about these things. And notice I'm smiling only not because I'm not happy about it, but also because I know that there are treacherous waters inside of the school system. As someone who has worked in school settings in a variety of capacities over a long period of time, there are many of you out there that have maybe worked in a lot of different school systems. I've got 6 that I've worked in, each of which shared similarities and each of which were vastly different in other aspects. And I am grateful to my time inside of school systems for the opportunity and experience that I had there. Okay, Shannon, bring me back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. I feel like I got a little off topic.
Well, I mean, it's fine, but I guess I want to kind of launch into a couple of different things, but let's begin with what are some of the basic elements of a behavior analytic worldview? What are we grounded in philosophically?
Well, so if we're going to say behavior analysis, let's be clear about the kind of behavior analyses there are out there, because there are several.
There are.
And I think that at least from a contemporary perspective, most behavior analysts would find themselves situated inside of a radical behavioral way of interpreting behavior. So this is Skinnerian psychology. This is radical behaviorism. And it was distinguished fundamentally from the previous type of behaviorism, which was considered methodological behaviorism. And the two, although they share some similarities, one of which was environmental determinism, which is what we'll talk about in a second, radical behaviorism, at least is the way that Skinner talked about it, was that what made it radical. So not only am I a child of the 80s, where radical was a word that I did use, and I used it with, I think, situationally appropriate, which makes me sound like a dork. I am a dork.
No. It makes you a child of the 80s, and you not only said it correctly, you shortened it to rad.
Yeah, right? You say rad. I think I still do say rad. Anyway, because some things are pretty rad, and radical behaviorism is rad. Let's be very clear about this. Skinner opened the door to things that methodological behaviorists, that sort of Watson articulated, though there were other contributors, just as there were other contributors to radical behaviorism, but we kind of focus in on their sort of primary locus. Skinner really opened the door to at least the intention for all behavior, really everything. And really with the dividing line was what you could see and what you couldn't see.
Yeah.
And what you can see is kind of what you're doing out in the world, and what you couldn't see were all the thoughts, feelings, emotions, imaginations, passions, all of those types of things, dreaming, imagining. And those were not really accounted for prior to, or at least it's not that they weren't accounted for, they were just sort of diminished in importance because they were not readily recordable. You couldn't take data on them. You couldn't see them.
Sure. the science was not yet ready, right? We did not know how to collect data
No.
on those things. And when you don't know how to do something, you tend to defer it. That's not
You do.
necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way we evolve, right? You don't jump right into things you don't know how to do when there are some things that you can see a path forward with.
Absolutely. And if I were to apply one criticism of both early behaviorisms and even radical behaviorisms, is that they did not just apply a deferral, like we'll get to it later, although Skinner did have some deferrals of note. A lot of it did diminish the role that these experiences have on a scientific analysis, making them not suitable for or not necessary for in some instances. And I think that is something that contemporary behavior analysts are overcoming. And there is much more of I think a willingness. Furthermore, to Shannon, to your point, I think our empirical endeavors have refined over the decades to put us in a better position to account for or to monitor over time these types of experiences for human beings, which are, again, depending on the way you look at things, are suitable for analysis.
Well, okay, so people who are going through a 40-hour RBT training, for example, and that is how they've gotten their information on behavior analysis, may or may not really understand what we even mean by the word empirical.
Sure.
Depending on whether the training was highly focused on skills or not.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of it's an old idea, and empiricism as a school of thought does not predate science necessarily, but it really did contribute to just a huge. I want to say the word explosion, but there's, obviously I do think that there were probably some unintended explosions, maybe in some chemistry labs and things like that came about from this. But, really simply put, it is not mystical. Empiricism is not mysticism, which is an equally relevant school of thought. You may not find yourself being terribly compelled by mysticism, but don't be so quick to diminish the experience of others that find mysticism to be a very compelling worldview. There are many, 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 many out there, and they're human beings too. But empiricism is really just the idea that you gain knowledge through your experience in the world, your contact with the world. And you may have in school been familiar with certain British empiricists. This was sort of the hub of where this was kind of going on. And there was variety for sure among Locke and Berkeley and various contributors to this way of thinking. I do think there are some misunderstandings that empiricism means data necessarily in the way that we think about data. There is a line between empiricism and empirical data that we find, objective data. You're counting, you're measuring, you're weighing, you're timing, all of the various dependent variables that experimental psychologists or other scientists employ. There's certainly a line between those things, but really fundamentally from an empirical point of view, it means that I'm going to gain knowledge of the world because I'm in contact with it. So.
Yeah. And I think I love the point that you just made, that people do sometimes conflate together empiricism and evidence base, that because we tend to say that an article or a treatment cannot be evidence-based unless it has empirical data, that they're considered one and the same. But it's not true. Yeah.
It's not necessarily true. And you give a good example there in terms of the kind of phrases that we use to sort of put guardrails on what may or may not be appropriate. Guardrails are good. Guardrails are ways of organizing our efforts so that there's some agreement. An agreement when it comes certainly to applied work is really important. It doesn't mean that there can't be pushback or that there can't be considerations for other things or other views brought in to kind of help bring about a more consensus view about what we're going to do. But when we're looking to help people, some kind of consensus is important. I'll use a non-behavior analytic example. If you go inside of a traditional medicine practice, it's good that there's consensus around fundamental key ideas about your physical health. And then that way, when you're greeted by the nurse practitioner, later on the doctor or specialist, it's good that there are fundamental consensus around your health, around the way that your body physiologically is in operation and is biologically organized. It would be chaotic if your oncologist believed one fundamental difference about the way your body works versus your family practitioner. And so we want to, when I say agreement, I don't mean everybody's like, just kind of walking together arm in arm and there's no disagreements. No, science is riddled with disagreements, and done professionally, which we hope to all strive toward, means that progress can be had. It's good that there's disagreements. But if you disagree on the fundamentals, again, this kind of worldview thing, that's going to be hard, harder than it necessarily needs to be. So oftentimes disciplines organize themselves around these kinds of worldviews. Doesn't mean everybody shares them all the time. Doesn't mean that there might be slight variations among individuals within that group, but more often than not, in key fundamental areas, they agree on certain things. So let's bring it back to behavior analysis and talk about one of the key fundamental aspects to a behavior analytic worldview, which is environmental determinism.
Right.
Which is kind of I don't know if it sounds like a heavy phrase. If you find yourself listening to this and you're like, no, this dork is way off on some weird thing that's not very practical, I'll try and make it somewhat practical. I may fail, but that's okay. That wouldn't be the first time. So environmental determinism in its most basic articulation is that it is your experience, your history, and your present circumstances, present setting, what you might call the context, that are going to explain what it is you're doing, the why. Why am I doing X? Well, it's because of this history of performance in and with your environment. It's not separate from, it's not like you can take yourself out of the environment. You are in it. You are the environment. You are part of it. You are interrelated. You can't take it away. It's all together all the time, right here, right now. And the idea is that all of those things, and you might say, yeah, but what about this really important thing? We're going to try and bring some evaluative statements about more important, less important. How do I consider everything? Those are all really good questions to be asking. And they don't always come with really good answers. Just know that from the basic perspective of behavior analysis, which is not shared only by behavior analysts, most scientists would have some form of environmental determinism. Chemists are a really good example. Why is it that, two hydrogen and an oxygen come together, you get water? They're not explaining that away towards some mystical power. They're looking at all of the environmental features that are present, that are really consistent. Chemists have done some really great work. It's super predictable. They understand the conditions under which it might form as a solid, a gas, all the various of liquid, all of the various conditions. That's environmental determinism. They're not explaining it through some other means or mechanisms. They're understanding that the setting and the chemical properties of these things together in this setting are going to result in this outcome. much like a behavior analyst might look at all of the various features or the relevant features. Can't look at everything. It's at least not yet. I don't want to speak to, again, I don't want to diminish. I might defer. I think that what we're learning
Our future. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, what we're learning, especially in our capacity, and the capacity in terms of humans, the human capacity to collect data is pretty remarkable. And now you're seeing this proliferation of technology designed to manage this data.
Mhm.
And so who knows where that's going to go. I think it's pretty exciting for those interested in that aspect. And there's a lot of work to do between now and then with the people that we serve that I'm not going to be able to wait for some AI technology that's going to help explain behavior. In fact, I may not need to wait that long to be effective, as been demonstrated for the various decades that behavior analysts have gone in and helped support individuals with a variety of different situations to live a more thriving life. So I'm excited for the future in that regard, and I don't need to wait for it to be effective now.
All right. So let me just do a brief summary of where we've gone so far. That behavior analysis as a scientific field is rooted in empiricism, in the idea that we find knowledge based on our interaction in the physical world, and that the explanations for the things that occur in the physical world are sufficient by looking at the environmental variables that are encountered in that world. Fair enough?
Yeah, as long as we maintain that we ourselves are part of that environment, as I don't want to diminish certainly the role that biological, physiological conditions of the individual play an important role in the way that that world is contacted, essentially, the way that that person is interacting with the world.
Yeah.
If you look at the examples of certain physical disabilities, they provided a clear example for which it is not that different from anybody else's experience. It's just a clear example. If I no longer have the use of my eyes, I am blind, I cannot see, my experience of the world is going to be unique to myself. That's not a profound statement. What I think makes it helpful is understanding that that statement is true for everybody, because everybody's experience in the world is in itself unique.
Sure. Yes, and we're not saying that, we're not saying, and never have, and Skinner even said that biology is a variable, and we may not yet know how to measure those variables yet.
Certainly.
And now we can do more than could be done when Skinner was active. And in the future, there will be even more. So when we say things like, he's acting this way because he has a stomach ache, even though I can't measure him having a stomach ache, it's still a valid line for behavior analysis to consider that this might be affecting his behavior in some kind of way. Okay.
Absolutely. And so that's a fine way to look at it.
I think most people are okay with that. I think sometimes when I'm talking with undergraduate students, I like to teach undergrads, right? So many of them are actually going to be working in the field of behavior analysis already in some form or another, or direct care in some fashion.
Yeah.
Sometimes living in the Deep South, in the Bible Belt, has people become very uncomfortable talking to each other, religion to religion, about the existence of free will.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, I like where we're going. All right.
Yeah. Okay. And then we bring in this other philosophy about determinism versus free will, which has actually a different spin on it than kind of what it seems to be talked about in the church pews. in terms of free will. Does the absence of free will in behavior analytic thought mean that people aren't responsible for their actions?
Fortunately, I don't have to make a declarative statement on here because much has been said and written about this issue itself.
Yeah.
Understanding what we mean by taking responsibility or attributing responsibility is really important behavior analytically relevant action, because we do this. And so understanding what does it mean to hold someone accountable, to think someone is responsible, is not out of the purview of behavior analysis. Where you, or the reason why you're attributing responsibility may be slightly different. But those are relevant topics, and they are as important to behavior analysts, or should be as important to behavior analysts, as they would be to anyone else. I don't want to stray too far away from some of your examples, and we can kind of situate this idea of free will. Now, at least the way that free will is articulated in maybe colloquial circles, more popular circles, and Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe it's been too long since I've hung out in like a non-dork circle. But my understanding of free will is this idea that I have free choice. I can do whatever I want. Now, the reason I do what I do is because I choose to do it, and I am accountable for that. And so far, I don't see anything different from behavior analysis. In fact, behavior analysis has an incredibly rich tradition of choice, understanding choice behavior, the way we allocate responding, the conditions under which I'm going to do A versus B. Choice, which is a notion inside of free will, is something that behavior analysts have done more, certainly more experimental work, and by extension have ways of helping support individuals gaining more choice, more alternatives to select from. I guess where things might change is then when you get into the murky waters of why.
Yeah.
So why did they do this and why did they do that? And depending on, again, that worldview, it's going to inform the direction you take toward that. And just remember, speaking broadly here, something that I said early on is that when you find yourself in the waters of conflicting worldviews, depending on the day and how you're feeling, be ready for an argument. If it gets into arguing territory, I would caution and maybe move towards a debate where something can be learned versus
An exchange
friction.
is
An exchange of ideas, which I'm not saying is easy. Again, it's easy to talk about. It's not always easy, especially in the moment, especially because humans are involved and we care, and things matter. And because of those features of our experience, we find ourselves in great tension with people that disagree with us. And so what I try to think about under those circumstances is that maybe I don't need to explain the why from my perspective, because maybe that's going to get in the way of actually doing the work that I'm trying to do. And maybe the why doesn't matter so much. Maybe I don't need to explain necessarily why I think this student is doing what they're doing, keeping it inside of a school context. But perhaps the fact that they're doing it is all that matters. And whether or not I get agreement from other stakeholders, teachers, other paraprofessionals, parents, administrators, all of the various individuals that play important roles inside of a school setting, I try to bring it back to what is it we're trying to do. And the likelihood is that we're all probably going to find agreement about what we're trying to accomplish, being in service to this person or to this class or to this group of students, whatever. And that's where I tend to find more effectiveness. It's when we get into the clashes among perspectives that our divisions are more illuminated and perhaps reinforced. It's where we have that sense of hopelessness. I can't get these things done. whenever I have felt those things, it's probably because I myself have leaned a little too heavy on the why and a little bit less on the what is, what's going on. I don't know if I've certainly met many teachers that I've worked with, many parents that I've worked for, that many administrators, doesn't matter, that probably look at the world very differently than I do.
Sure.
And I think that's a good thing. I think that the last thing that you need to do if you're listening to this is feel pressure in changing the way you look at the world because of the thing that you're doing. You might find yourself in behavior analysis because you just care so abundantly for the people that you're working in service toward. And I would just be there with that. I don't know if there's a better motivation than that alone. And if you understand reinforcement theory and you kind of understand the sort of sequence of events that's going on and you see progress, and that progress is the biggest reinforcer to you, the thing that really has you continuing to stay excited, well, then I don't know if anything needs to change. Maybe you have a supervisor that is a little too aggressive with the whole worldview stuff. Well, maybe they're just super passionate about it. And, I'm not going to try and make it sound like it's any easier to be in the midst of really passionate people. It can feel a bit confronting. But I think for myself, I find a little bit more comfort in knowing that, well, that's something that they really care about. It doesn't mean anything about me. It's just something that they really care about.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think you make a good point that you don't have to be, everyone in the room doesn't have to hold the same worldview in order to work together. And in fact, sometimes what that does is if you have a different worldview, it makes you emphasize different parts of whatever the problem is or the solution. And so when we're sitting around the table, if I'm very dyed-in-the-world behavior analyst and just, really want to look at this person's learning history and how this brought them to where they are. And then I've got someone with me who's very, whatever, they're very humanist. And you've got another person who is very religious in their worldview. And we're all talking about the role of personal responsibility, the role of the people who are supporting kids or whoever in whatever school, what drives us, what we're focused on. Then we're going to identify different risks to whatever decision we're about to make and potentially different outcomes. But we're probably all still going to come to, there's a limited number of things that we as human beings can do, actions that we can take to support one another, but we come up with different boundaries sometimes. And in doing so, maybe we look out for the best of everyone around us.
Yeah. To that point about, I think I've probably been in rooms with more behavior analysts that are actually closer to humanism than they probably are to radical behaviors.
Yeah.
And if you just look at the basic tenets of humanism, certainly from an applied behavior analytic perspective, pretty hard to kind of go against them, right? I mean, thinking about what a human being needs versus like a supernatural side of things, which is again, I'm not an expert in the theories and philosophies of humanism. That's kind of the basic dividing line, that it's about the human being versus a supernatural element to that. That's completely compatible with behavior analysis. And furthermore, there's nothing about the application of our science that has any, there's no rules that say we can't work for a common goal because we have different ways of thinking about things. That's completely the opposite. I know from my own personal experience, when I push a little too hard on the why, I don't get very far. It doesn't matter. I mean, it really doesn't matter in the big scheme of things. I can't self-select the population of people I want to work with because they hold this belief or that belief. That starts looking pretty gross when you start looking at it that way. And I don't think behavior analysts do that. I think more often than not, you're going to find accepting people. You're going to find compassionate, caring, curious, empathetic people inside of behavior analysis, kind of like you're going to find inside of school settings.
Sure.
Shannon, if you'd give me if you'd be willing, can I say something about acceptance? Because I think it's relevant.
Yeah.
Right. So oftentimes I fear, and I hope I'm wrong, that the notion of acceptance is misunderstood. Not fully, but misunderstood. Because oftentimes I hear the word in a way that I think the speaker means to agree with it, to be okay with it, to put up with it. And that's not what acceptance is. You have to accept the circumstances. It's often used as a phrase to say, well, this is what you got to deal with it.
Suck it up and move on.
Suck it up and move on, take it, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, whatever kind of phrase you want to use. And that's not what acceptance is. That's adding something to acceptance that it is not. And acceptance is actually really simple. It just means to receive. And then everything you do after that is different. And that's the misunderstanding I think acceptance is. Acceptance just means to take in. Everything after that, taking in is something different. It's your other behavior in relation to that thing. So to accept something is to take it in. And then you have the choice to do something. What are you going to do about it? And there's various ways to organize your choices. You can organize your choices based on value. So I accept that my caseload is too high. I accept that someone called out of school today, and now I'm in the care of 3 people, which is not what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be one-on-one with this learner. Acceptance doesn't mean these are the facts, and now I just have to put up with it. That's not accepting. Accepting is, this is the circumstance. I'm asked to be in charge of the care of 3 people instead of 1. Acceptance over. Now, what am I going to do with it? Now, what am I going to do about it? And all of that other stuff is not acceptance. It's all the other stuff. And you can take it in any number of different directions. And so I think that you never have to accept anything if what it means is that you have to put up with something. I'm not going to tell you to put up with anything. I don't know. I don't know the circumstance. You don't have to put up with that stuff. But anyway, thank you for letting me have that little tangent on acceptance, because I do think there is something to be said about taking in someone else's perspective. Doesn't mean I have to agree with you. Doesn't mean I have to change my behavior to make you happy. I don't have to do that. But I do think a lot can happen if I accept it. I really take it in. I take in that I'm working with a family, let's say, that has fundamentally different perspectives on why their child is under the circumstances that they find themselves in. Maybe they've got like crystals and incense and like it was like what I would consider to be very different from the way I would organize my behavior. Maybe they're doing that. It doesn't mean that I'm going to come in there and be like, well, you know what? You're totally wrong. You are fundamentally, absolutely wrong. And in fact, this is bad.
And I do think, I'm glad you're saying that, Tim, because I do think that is a place where we sometimes feel caught because we have been guided in intervening when we see pseudoscience. And there have been leaders in our field who have said the direct opposite of what you just said, that we are ethically obligated to say, no, this is wrong. This is unacceptable. You are doing harm.
Well, let's talk about what I think the intention behind that pseudoscience is. what I think the intention to call out pseudoscience. First, I think we have to understand the situation we find ourselves in where we are confronted by quote unquote pseudoscience. I think under scientific circumstances, the rigor applied to scientific endeavors is different than situations that applied behavior analysts often find themselves in, where they're not actually participating in the rigor of science, although they may apply rigorous aspects to the practice of that science. I'm not talking to a mom who believes firmly in the role that, let's say, this crystal has on their child's behavior. I'm not going to go into an argument with that parent about that thing. I'm going to find a way to ensure that that learner, that person is getting the medical care that they need beyond just their medically necessary care that a behavior analyst might provide. And it's going to be a journey. And I want to be an advocate for that person. And frankly, the whole family. It does not mean that I'm going to attack fundamentally their perspective on the world. Now, if it gets to such an extent where I am unable to practice the application of the science of human behavior, if I cannot practice that because there are too many conflicting variables, well, then we're going to have to make a change, and we're going to have to do that ethically, and we're going to need to move that in a direction, because that's something that I can't do ethically. I can't amputate important parts of my practice because of a conflicting worldview. If we get to that level, we're not even speaking the same language, and that can be dangerous. That's where danger can be had. But let's say the parent is willing, the teacher is willing, the other students are willing to participate in behaviors that move us along, that's in service to the student, let's say, that's being integrated into a classroom or whatever. Who cares what they believe? Who cares? Who cares that the parent, the teacher, the caregiver, whomever, thinks that the reason that the child is now doing something different than it was before is different than the way I think about it? Doesn't matter. It really, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. I get to have my beliefs. I get to have my convictions. I get to have my passions and perspectives. And thank goodness everyone else gets to have theirs too.
And that is a lovely statement, and it is a true statement, and I agree with it 100%. But it's really hard sometimes when you know you've put a lot of work.
Totally.
And they attribute it to something totally different.
Well,
it's a growing up.
Explore that. Let's explore that, because that itself is a beautiful example of give me credit.
Yeah.
Give me credit. I did that. I did that.
Well, go with their credit, yeah.
That is perhaps the most unbehavior analytic view. Skinner talked about this in a number of different areas. I think describing it really, really well in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, described it again really well and about behaviorism, the science of human behavior. There are a number of different places where Skinner articulated this fact. I want all the responsibility to be allocated to me when the outcome is good, and I want none of it. And I want none of it when it's bad.
No, of course not. It's because you did it wrong.
And that is a beautiful expression of something that we all share.
Yeah,
we share that, and that isn't. It isn't. Now, notice I didn't explain any of that. I didn't say why we feel that way. I just described something that human beings share. And when you describe it as that, something that we all share, it's all a continuum. Some people are really driven by those things, and some people almost not at all. But it is a characteristic of the human experience that we all share along that continuum to some degree. And there's nothing wrong with that. What you might do about that might lead you down to paths that are less effective or more effective. I don't know. But at the end of the day, you didn't do anything. You participated. Yes. You played an outsized role in your participation. but you didn't do anything. You don't have the magical powers of a deity. You don't have the grace of of some supernatural thing. You don't have these things. You just participated. And I think that there is probably nothing more humbling than being okay with just being a participant. Doesn't mean you're not important. Doesn't mean you didn't bring value. Doesn't mean that you didn't play an important role in participating in the outcome of that. But we're not that person. That person actually is the one that did something. That student, that learner, that human being, they're the ones that did something. And I would be much more comfortable in attributing the glory of something getting done by giving it to that person, because that's the person that deserves it. They did something. They were willing to participate in the environment, and that's a beautiful thing. And furthermore, we just don't need that much credit. We're very effective across a number of different settings and across a number of different humans. That's not going to be the only experience of participation that you will have if you stay within this discipline. You will have countless heartwarming, hard circumstances that you will be able to build your experience on, and all of which are important participants in your own behavior analytic journey. So yeah.
I love that. Thank you, Tim. This has been
There you go.
fantastic. This has been a very fun way to launch off this little mini series that we're going to produce. And I'm going to have to look at this because I should have known. You and we're going to talk longer than planned. So it said this was going to be about 30 minutes, and it ended up being about 50. So we may even break this up into 2 parts. We may leave it on. I don't know how it'll work out, but it's all going out into the world. And I think that I just want to say thank you for helping me do this.
Oh, Shannon, it has been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for giving me the soapbox from which to yap. I like to yap. So thank you very much. And thanks again to all of those that find themselves, especially if you've made it all the way to this point. You made it to this point. Big thank you. And if you found yourself leaving prior to this, well, then you didn't hear that part, but I thank you too and appreciate all of it. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to sign us off, and just to do all of the business at the end, this is the Behavioral View. We drop at least once a month with talks with interesting people in behavior analysis, and we're going to start doing mini drops, trying to hit specialty areas like behavior technicians, people working in education. So keep an eye out. You just never know what we're going to bring next. Follow us on social media on Facebook as Central Reach Institute, and on LinkedIn at the same name, and you'll get maybe a little heads up about what's coming next. Tim, thanks much, and I will see you soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Behavioral View.